Now, let's create a new interface named iCategory Repository. This interface will handle all the logic related to categories, including getting all categories, retrieving a specific category by ID, fetching books by category, and checking if a category exists in the database. Later, we'll implement this interface in a new repository class to connect it directly to our database using Entity Framework. Now that our interface is ready, let's create the implementation class, Category Repository. This class will handle all database operations related to categories. Inside the constructor, we inject our data context so we can access the database through Entity Framework. Then, we implement each method. GetAllCategories returns a list of all categories. GetCategory retrieves a single category by its ID. GetBooksByCategory gets all books that belong to a specific category. And finally, CategoryExists checks if a category exists before performing any operations. With this repository in place, our API can now manage categories just like it does with books. Now let's create our category controller to expose our new endpoints. This controller will allow us to fetch all categories, get a specific category by its ID, and list all the books that belong to a particular category. We start by injecting our iCategory repository into the controller so it can access all the category-related data from the database. Then we define three get endpoints. The first one, API categories, returns all the categories. The second one, API categories ID, returns a single category. And the third one, API categories ID books, returns all the books linked to that category. With this controller in place, our API can now manage both books and categories seamlessly. And we can test all these endpoints directly from Postman. Now let's create a category DTO class. DTO stands for Data Transfer Object, and it helps us control exactly what data we send back to the client. In this case, our category DTO will only expose two properties, the ID and the name, since that's all we need when listing or displaying categories. This keeps our API responses clean and focused without exposing unnecessary details from our database models. Now, let's update our category controller to use our new category DTO. Instead of returning the full category model, which could include extra data and relationships, we'll map each category to a simpler DTO that only includes the ID and name. This keeps our API responses clean and focused, while also protecting our internal database structure. Later on, we can even automate this mapping using a library like AutoMapper. But for now, we'll do it manually with a simple select statement. Now, let's create a new interface called iCountry Repository. This interface will handle all database operations related to countries and their authors. We'll start with a method to get all countries and another to get a specific country by its ID. Then we'll add a method to find a country based on a given author and one more to list all authors from a specific country. Finally, we'll include a simple Boolean method called CountryExists, which will help us validate country IDs before running other operations. This structure will make it easy to manage the relationship between countries and authors inside our API. Now let's implement our iCountry repository interface inside a new class called Country Repository. Just like before, we inject our data context through the constructor so we can access the database using Entity Framework. Then, we implement each method. GetAllCountries retrieves all the countries from our database. GetCountry gets a specific country by its ID. GetCountryByAuthor finds the country an author belongs to. GetAuthors from country lists all the authors associated with a given country. And finally, CountryExists checks if a country record exists before we do anything else. With this repository done, we now have all the logic we need to manage countries and their authors in our application. Now that our country repository is ready, let's expose it through a new controller called Countries Controller. Just like our previous controllers, we start by injecting the iCountry repository into the constructor. Then we add 4 endpoints. The first one, API countries, returns all the countries. The second one, API countries ID, returns a specific country by its ID. The third endpoint, API countries author ID, allows us to find the country that an author belongs to. And finally, API countries ID authors returns all the authors associated with a given country. With this controller, our API can now manage countries and link them to their authors, giving us a clean and powerful structure for the next parts of our book review app. Now, let's create a country DTO class. Just like our category DTO, this data transfer object will define exactly what information we expose from our country model. In this case, we only need 2 fields, the ID and the name. This makes our responses much cleaner and prevents us from accidentally exposing complex relationships or sensitive data. Using DTOs like this is a best practice in any modern API because it keeps our internal data structure separate from what the client sees. Now that our country DTO is ready, let's refactor our countries controller to use it. Instead of returning the full country model, which could include extra details and relationships, we'll map each country to a simple DTO that only includes the ID and name. We use a link select statement to project our data from the model to the DTO before sending it back in the response. This keeps our API responses lightweight, secure, and perfectly structured for client-side applications. In the next steps, we can do the same for authors and books, keeping our entire API consistent and clean. Now let's go back to our program file to register all our dependencies. We'll add each of our repositories to the dependency injection container: the book repository, the category repository, and the country repository. This allows ASP.NET Core to automatically create and inject these services wherever we need them, like in our controllers, without us having to manually instantiate anything. Finally, we make sure our data context is connected to the SQL Server database, and we're ready to start testing all of our new endpoints.